everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. The state of Minnesota is filing civil rights charges against the Minneapolis Police Department over the death of George Floyd. Governor Tim Walz made that announcement during a press conference on Tuesday. He also addressed the violent protests gripping his state, taking aim at President Trump's push to deploy greater force.
We're not going to restore peace on our streets by having a bigger group of National Guard show up. We're not going to establish peace on our streets by keeping a curfew in place all the time. We're going to establish peace on our streets when we address the systemic issues.
The announcement comes as protests over George Floyd's death continue across the nation. President Trump did not address them when he ventured outside the White House today to visit his second church inside of 24 hours, following another night of protests in the nation's capital. Tuesday's visit to the St. John Paul II National Shrine was swiftly condemned by Washington's Catholic Archbishop, who said it was, quote, baffling and reprehensible that any Catholic facility would allow itself to be so egregiously misused and manipulated in a fashion that violates our religious principles. The president is also facing criticism for a visit to another religious site. Mr. Trump walked from the White House to St. John's Episcopal Church Monday night. The church office was damaged by a fire during protests over the weekend. Federal officers used tear gas to disperse peaceful protesters who were demonstrating along the president's route. At the church, President Trump held up a Bible and took pictures for about 10 minutes before returning to the White House. Meanwhile, the Democrats' presumptive presidential nominee, Joe Biden, made his first trip outside his home state of Delaware since the outbreak began. Biden addressed the protests during his speech in Philadelphia Tuesday. He said President Trump was, quote, part of the problem, and called on Congress to take steps to reverse what he said was systemic racism.
It's going to take more than talk. We've had talk before. We've had protests before. We've got to now vow to make this at least an area of action and reverse the systemic racism. When peaceful protesters dispersed in order for a president from the doorstep of the people's house, the White House, using tear gas and flash grenades in order to stage a photo op in one of the most historic churches in the country, or at least in Washington, D.C., we can be forgiven for believing the president is more interested in power than in principle. The president held up the Bible at St. John's Church yesterday. I just wish he opened it once in a while instead of brandishing it.
Biden's speech comes as 8 states and Washington, D.C. are holding primaries today. Many of these elections were postponed because of the coronavirus pandemic. Congressman Jim Clyburn of South Carolina joins me now. He is Majority Whip in the House of Representatives. Congressman, thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So Minnesota's move to bring civil rights charges against the Minneapolis Police Department is in addition to the investigation by the Department of Justice. How significant are these steps, and what else would you like to see happen?
That seems to be very, very significant. I was a bit bemused when I heard that the state will be bringing charges against a local police department. I think that's very, very interesting, and there's something that we ought to really feel pretty good about. I think that we have to begin to take action here. We can't allow these things to continue to happen. I don't know what may be going on in Minneapolis. I'm just shocked at what I've been hearing, what I've been reading recently about the proliferation of activities regarding neck restraints, the number of neck restraints that have been used by this department. It seems very interesting to me that this is going on. The number of policemen who have been brought up on charges and who have been complained about over the years. That seems like a mighty big number to me. And the fact that only one police officer has ever been convicted of anything, and that happened to be a black police officer who happened to have shot a white person. And I got a call this morning saying that white person's family or the person itself got a $20 million settlement for that shooting. I'd like to know what has happened involving black victims by that department. So there's something very interesting going on in Minneapolis that all of us need to take a harder look at. And the question is, as someone said earlier that I heard this morning, is there some kind of unwritten rule, is some kind of secret oath that's been taken by various police departments? I don't know, but something is just not right. I feel in my gut that something is going on here that we need to get to the bottom of.
Well, as you know, Joe Biden today laid out a number of steps he believes should be taken to address race issues, and they include passing a bill to outlaw police chokeholds and a National Police Oversight Board, among others. What kinds of conversations have you had with Mr. Biden on this issue?
I have not had any conversations with Mr. Biden on this issue. I would caution, however, that we look at neck restraints. You know, when you start to boil it down and say chokeholds, now chokehold, I know that we've got legislation sponsored by Hakeem Jeffries in the Congressional Black Caucus to outlaw chokeholds. But I've said to the members of my caucus, let's go beyond that. I don't know whether or not you would call a knee to the neck a chokehold, but that's a neck restraint. I don't know whether you call whatever they're doing with these neck restraints to cause people to pass out. I understand 44 instances of that in Minneapolis. So let's just look at all of this, these not illegal, but unusual things that are being done by police officers and outlaw these things. So I think the idea is a good one, but we got to make sure that we don't allow the legislation be passed that have loopholes in it that will allow people to get around it. So a chokehold may not get to everything that needs to be gotten to in this instance. Certainly, a knee to the neck is different from a chokehold, but seem to be just as deadly.
So former President George W. Bush put out a statement on Tuesday regarding the death of George Floyd, saying that, quote, many doubt the justice of our country and with good reason, end quote. To many people, changing the underpinnings of systemic inequality seems overwhelming. Does Congress actually have the power and ability to change what is taking place in some of these local police departments across the country?
Yes, I think so. We certainly can pass laws, and you pass laws to be enforced by the administration. I think we do have the power, and we ought to use that power. I think that the Congress is made up of 535 people from all across this nation. If we can pass legislation with good, solid votes, I think that will be a reflection of what is going on in this country, and I think it will set a tone for what should go on in this country. That's what happened back in the 1960s. The legislation that we passed, that Lyndon Johnson championed back in the 1960s, leading to the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act. And I'm going to stop with that. Medicaid, Medicare, Higher Education Commission, all these things were passed as a part of the Great Society program. And we ought to stop lying about the effects of it. I can't tell you how many times I've heard lies on the floor of the House of Representatives about how the Great Society failed. It did not fail. Those laws are still in place today. Medicaid and Medicare are not failures. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act are not failures. The Higher Education Act, not failure. Elementary and Secondary Education Act. These things have been misused, they have been underfunded, and they have been curtailed in such a way. We ought to look at all of this. So we know.
Is there enough appetite, Congressman? I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you think there's enough appetite in Washington right now, not just among your fellow lawmakers, but in the White House when it comes to this issue of police reform?
Well, let's pass the bills and send it to the White House and let the country see exactly who is doing this. I just heard a lion treat tweet this morning saying that he has done more for African Americans than any president since Abraham Lincoln. What kind of stupidity is that? That is absolutely just downright stupid.
Let me ask you a little bit about some of the rhetoric. So in his inaugural address, President Trump said, quote, "American carnage stops right here and stops right now." And he pledged to get the job done, he said. Do you think the president is living up to that promise?
Well, it all depends on how you define carnage. It seems as if the president considers the exercise of one's First Amendment rights to be carnage. That, to me, is how he seems to be acting. So I don't know how he defined the word. How we define it, generally, he has contributed to it more than any president in my lifetime. And I don't think any president says maybe Woodrow Wilson.
So let's turn to Joe Biden. Several community leaders told the former vice president on Monday that these protests really do underscore the need, in their view, to pick a woman of color as his vice presidential running mate. Have you talked to Joe Biden about that since George Floyd's death, and do you agree?
No, I have not talked to. The last time I had a substantive conversation with Vice President Biden and his wife Jill was on Easter Sunday. I do not make it my business to call the vice president or even his campaign about stuff. I just do what I think is the right thing to do. I make statements like I'm making now as to what I think we ought to do, but I don't think it's my business to tell the vice president how to run his campaign, and I don't. I will say this, however, I do believe that we as members of Congress have a responsibility to put in place legislative activity that hopefully will be instructive to the current president and the vice president who is running to be president. We can pass legislation that will be instructive to them. And we can start by developing some new pathways to justice. Justice not just in the judicial system, but justice in education, justice in healthcare, with liberty and justice for all. That's the vision we recite when we pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. Let's have liberty and justice for all. That's the vision that we have not lived up to, and we ought to stop weaponizing people for calling for the living up to our vision. When I talk about that, when we were putting together the so-called CARES Act, I was vilified on the floor of the Senate by the majority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, calling me out by position. Well, I don't back away from that. I believe that we need to restructure things in our judicial system, in our healthcare system, in our education system to live out that vision of liberty and justice for all.
So I want to ask you about comments from a Delaware reverend who told Joe Biden on Monday that it was difficult to be his surrogate to younger voters concerned about his work on the 1994 crime bill. How would you address those concerns?
I will address that just like I addressed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. The 1965 Voting Rights Act was a great piece of legislation. It still is a great piece of legislation, but the Supreme Court just gutted Section 4. That makes Section 5 inoperative. It is still the Civil Rights Act. Lyndon Johnson is not responsible, nor the Congress back then responsible for what the Supreme Court just did. And I've been telling all of my colleagues, and I will say the same thing to the Vice President. The 1994 crime bill, and I want to say this for the public, it's not the same crime bill today that it was when we passed it. It's not the same thing. We had community policing in that bill, and we don't have community policing anymore. We had violence against women in that bill. That's a good thing. We outlaw many mandatory sentences in that bill. That's a good thing. But the 1994 crime bill passed in the spring of the year. And later that year, in November of 1994, Newt Gingrich took over as Speaker of the House. And they went about the business of gutting that crime bill, taking all the good stuff that we had in it out of it, and leaving all the punitive stuff in it. So the crime bill today is not the same 1994 crime bill that I voted for back in 1994, and people ought to stop fooling with that. They ought to know better, and they ought to act better. It's not the same bill today that it was when we passed it. Just, that's a fact.
We only have about a minute or so left, Congressman. I wonder what your message would be to young people, especially, many of whom are out marching in the streets because they feel that the system has failed them and has failed the generations that have come before them. I wonder what you would say to them, those young people especially, who don't think that it has worked, that your way, that the way of other elected officials to try to work from within the system has been effective in changing fundamentally what has been the experience of so many African American men in this country?
I would say to them what I said in my memoirs, Blessed Experiences. And by the way, it's a book that the readers of Amazon give 5 stars. So it's not a joke book. I say to them today what I said when I wrote the book, what I believed all my life. In this country, the pendulum goes back and forth. Our society goes back and forth just like the pendulum on the clock. It goes from left to right, back left again, back right again. It has always been that way ever since it's been a country. And the extent to which it goes to the right gets checked by people when they participate. So when I was a student on the campus of South Carolina State, meeting my late wife in jail, I didn't go to jail for any kind of carjacking or hijacking. I went to jail trying to change the laws. We went to jail wondering whether or not we were doing the right thing. We changed those laws. We did the right thing. And many people are benefiting from it today. When I went to jail back then, I think there were 2 or 3 African Americans in the United States Congress. Today, there are 55. That's a change. When I went to jail, we didn't have a Voting Rights Act. We didn't have a Civil Rights Act. We didn't have a fair housing law. All of those are good things, and we need to keep pressing. We are in the pursuit of a more perfect union. This is not a perfect country. It is a good country. It's even a great country. We got to make this country's greatness accessible and affordable for all of its citizens. And you don't do that by criticizing or by standing on the sidelines or by throwing bricks or by burning down buildings. You do that by building upon those sacrifices that our parents made and try to do better for our children. So criticizing and standing on the sidelines, burning down places, I will say this to any young person that's ever played sports. One thing you learn early in playing sports, that if you play the other person's game, if you play your opponent's game on your opponent's turf, your opponent will win. We cannot play their game. Violence is their game. Insulting is their game. Let's don't play their game. We win when we stand in solidarity with each other. And when we pursue a more perfect union, doing so by maintaining our faith in the God Almighty and our faith in each other.
Congressman Jim Clyburn. Congressman, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.